idea?
Help
Help
us!
us!
Help us! Help us!
Save us! How can you sleep? Get up and call on your God, and maybe He can spare our lives. What kind of work do you do?
Where do you come from? What is your country?
What's that you claiming?
What should we do to you
to make this sea calm down?
Pick me up and throw me into the sea, and then it'll calm down. It's all my fault. All this is happening.
Man, no, we ain't doing that. No.
No.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
The sea was getting rougher and rougher, so they asked him, "What should we do to you to make the sea calm down for us?" "Pick me up and throw me into the sea," he replied, "and it will become calm. I know that it is my fault that this great storm has come upon you." Instead, the men did their best to row back to land, but they could not, for the sea grew even wilder than before. Then they cried out to the Lord, "Please do not let us die for taking this man's life. Do not hold us accountable for killing an innocent man." Then they took Jonah and threw him overboard, and the raging sea grew calm. At this, the men greatly feared the Lord, and they offered a sacrifice to the Lord and made vows to him. Hey, friends, everybody. Good to be with you again on today. This is Miss Bennett. So last week we were in Jonah chapter 1, the same chapter we're in today, but we talked about how how Jonah literally got ran down by God. Now, Jonah didn't want to do what God asked him to do, and so God kind of ran him down, didn't he? Well, in the same chapter, I want us to make sure that we don't overlook something that's very important. Jonah, in verse 12, owns the fact that he is the reason everyone is in the predicament that they're in. Jonah displays an incredible amount of courage and just says, you know what? In verse 12, because the sea was, in verse 11 we see the sea was getting rougher and rougher, and it was harder for the sailors to do what they needed to do in the sea. They were throwing cargo overboard. And Jonah's down in the bottom of the boat asleep while this is going on. So the captain's like, hey man, how you sleeping? Get to praying. But Jonah it was determined that it was Jonah's fault that this was happening. And Jonah owns it. In verse 12, he says, after they asked him in verse 11, what should we do to you to make this sea calm down? And he says in verse 12, pick me up and throw me in the sea, and it'll become calm. And then he says, I know that it is my fault that this great storm has come upon you. It is so important that even when we're scared, even when we're not sure how things are going to turn out, that we own the things that we do that cause trouble for us and for other people. Okay? So Jonah displays an incredible amount of courage here in chapter 1. Is he courageous in the beginning? No, because he's running from what God asked him to do. But then he turns right around and says he owns what he did. Hey, you know what? It's on me. He owns what he did. And it is important for us to do the same thing. Okay?
Hey friends, this is Elder Bennett here. I know you've already received a summary of the lesson from my wife, Matrice Bennett, and I just wanted to step in just to say one word about today's lesson when we're talking about Jonah and his trip to Nineveh. Even though he was disobedient while he was on the boat, he did display some leadership qualities that are worth notating here. Of course, Matrice had already talked about courage and integrity, and I want to piggyback on her comment on the word integrity. You know, C.S. Lewis quoted that integrity is doing the right thing even when no one is watching. And the point I want to make here is that once Jonah identified that he was the problem and he assumed responsibility for what was going on, that is integrity. And in verse 15 is when the sailors threw Jonah over the boat because he had took responsibility for his disobedience. When he was thrown over the boat, that is when God stepped in. The verse says, the sailors picked Jonah up and threw him into the raging sea, and the storm stopped at once. Once you make your decision, once you make the right decision, and you take ownership of your actions, that is when God will step in. God will step in to protect you or to make sure that everything is fine or everything goes your way. Either way, that is when God will step in. But you have to make the right decision. And there's always a right time to make the right decision. So integrity is doing the right thing even when no one is watching. It's not easy. Don't get me wrong. It's not easy to make the right decision, but it's imperative. And once you make the right decision, that is when God will step in. Amen.